Chapter 7. Sheriff Hardwick's tight-mouthed investigation of the murder of Ace Cangle kept Alcaster awake till a late hour. What little evidence the lawman managed to dig up only rendered him more doggedly persistent. He questioned a score of men, bull-headed and authoritative. He could not even establish a strong possibility that Cangle had been killed inside the Rimrock house, and any inkling of the truth that, wherever he had met his fate, Ace had actually been eased into the alley from the top floor of the place was far removed from his boldest speculations. Pat Stevens lingered on the fringe of things, hoping to learn who among the men in town might express unguarded surprise about Cangle having been found in the alley. In no other way could he have discovered who might have been interested in having the dead man located in Sam and Ezra's room. He had no luck. Chad Hanlon did not appear in the investigation at all. Though Pat spent some time in trying to hunt him up, the man seemed to have disappeared completely. Nor was he in evidence the following morning, when Pat made the rounds of the saloons and livery barn in an effort to verify the fact. Judging from such conversations as he overheard, no one found any particular significance in Hanlon's absence, least of all Hardwick, though in Pat's mind the circumstance was conspicuous, to say the least. He did not take the trouble to remark his opinion, though. With the ranch deed stolen, there was no longer anything to hold him in town. Before the sun was 2 hours high, he was on his way into the hills, and noon found him drawing near the anvil. And now that he was the owner of this sun-swept southern range, he looked about him with an even keener appreciation than before. "Don't get proud now, Stevens," he murmured to himself with a small private grin. "A few years ago you couldn't lay claim to an old sod house, let alone 2 ranches, and right now you're not any too sure about this one." Despite his self-reminder against undue cockiness, however, it was a assured and a confident figure that rode quietly into the ranch yard a few minutes later. His glance was arrested by the sight of 2 men snagging horses out of one of the corrals. He dismounted there and sat watching a moment, then casually dismounted. One of the 2, obviously Hannon's punchers, was a small, gnarled, not-hard man of middle age, whose sour visage appeared twisted into a persistent sneer. This man finally turned to flick Pat with snaky eyes. "What you want, stranger?" he asked carelessly. "The name's Stevens," Pat returned quietly. "Maybe it is," was the surly rejoinder, "but that don't mean nothing to me." "Take it easy, Ep," muttered the other man, a lanky, horse-faced old-timer with ears almost as big as his oversized hands and feet. Pat had not taken his eyes off the tattered specimen called Ep. His tone grew curt, though he did not raise his voice. "You're Stack, aren't you? It might interest you, if you don't already know, that I bought the anvil from Hanville yesterday." He waited for that to sink in. Scarcely to his surprise, he found presently that apparently it wasn't going to, at least as far as Ep Stack was concerned. "Yeah," Stack scoffed, unimpressed. "I ain't got no time for jokes." Pat smiled oddly. "Then I won't bother you with any," he assured coolly, and suddenly his words cracked like a whip. "Look, Stack, as of right now, you're either working for me or not at all, and I think it's probably going to be the last," he added grimly. Ep whirled on him, flushed and darkly. "On your way, you," he flared menacingly. "I got orders from Hanlon to run any gazebo named Stevens off this place." Standing there crouched, he looked as if he actually meant what he said. Pat's lean face cracked in a grin. He took a swift stride forward, batting the gun out of Stack's hand as the latter strove desperately to claw it out, and the .45 bounced off the ground. With a snarl, Ep dove straight towards him. "Get that buzzard, Charlie," he raged hoarsely. He strove to grapple with Pat and throw him. Pat calmly sat a heel behind the man's foot and pushed a broad palm into his face, and Stack promptly sat down with a violence that jarred his teeth. He showed signs of frothing at the mouth as he scrambled up. Looking disgusted, Pat grabbed the fellow and flopped him, helpless and sprawling, over his knee. Whack! Whack! Dust flew as he slapped the hard hand down upon the seat of Stack's pants. Charlie Bain gruffed irrepressibly at that ignoramus sight, only to suppress his mirth and confusion as Pat raked him with an inquiring glance. The gangling, stoop-shouldered puncher had made no attempt to spring to Ep's aid, nor had he a second of any Stack's violent talk. He turned away, fumbling with his stray rope. It was plain that whatever the outcome, he didn't plan to join in the hostile welcome according to Pat. With a last resounding whack for the gnarled puncher, Stevens dumped Ep unceremoniously into the dust. Stack rose more slowly this time, his wicked features corded and suffused. His wrath was ablaze, but the unpreceded things that had happened to him in the past few minutes gave him some pause. Pat took a step towards him. Have you got a horse of your own? Climb on it and get off the place, Stack, and make it fast. You're fired. Ep stumbled backwards hastily, his mouth working, and at last he found his tongue, and words boiled out of him in a trembled screech. Hanlon will hear this. You ain't seen the last of me, Stevens, not by a long shot. Pat ignored him, turned to Bain. What's your opinion of me, friend? He snapped colorlessly. Maybe you prefer Chad Hanlon, too? Old Charlie shook his head sullenly. I punch cows for a living, he returned in a subdued voice. Reckon you know how to look after yourself, Stevens. You firing me or not? His manner was embarrassed, but Pat liked his stubborn blunt of speech. Clearly Bain was prepared to accept him for better or worse as the new owner. You know the layout. You just go on about your work. He nodded. If either of us changes his mind, there's plenty of time for that. Neither looked around as they heard Ep Stack trot away astride his horse, sputtering under his breath. At the edge of the yard, the gnarled man turned in his saddle to yell blistering verbiage at Pat Stevens. And then his horse struck into a gallop and he was gone, crashing through the pines at a headlong haste. Pat picked up Stack's fallen six-gun and stood watching Charlie Bain saddle up. The man had grown old in his profession and was beginning to cripple up. He couldn't move fast. The fact might have contributed to his caution, but Pat was willing to credit him with more common sense till he proved otherwise. At best, he'd prove a little more than an old pensioner. Hang on a minute. There's another hand around here, isn't there? Pat called as Charlie started to jog away. Where's Santos? He's working the range, was the reply. He left this morning on the long circle. I see. And who's doing the cooking? Nico, Bain told him. Pat made up his mind that Nico Santos, the Mexican who had manifestly done most of the heavy work on the ranch, was the man best fitted to inform him concerning present prevailing conditions. The fact that most of Chad Hannon's personal possessions and all of his clothes seemed to be gone from the ranch house was sufficient proof that the man had pulled out, and that Ep Stack, his belligerent puncher, must have been aware of it. In the light of this, it was difficult to fathom Stack's attempt to bluff him, unless Hanlon's confidently expected to return, and Ep at last knew of this also. Pat filed that circumstance away in his head. He did not make the mistake of underrating Stack, despite the man's ineffectual anger. In his own right, Ep was nothing more, a mere cipher, as with Hanlon himself. It was the capacity of such men for underhanded treachery that made them dangerous. Nico Santos rode in shortly before sunset. He remembered Pat, and though he was surprised to find him in charge, greeted him with the old-world courtesy of his kind towards those in authority. You're my new boss now? I'll work hard for you, senor, he said simply. Between them, Nico's and old Charlie acquainted Pat with affairs on the rundown ranch. Over the supper the dexterous Mexican quickly prepared, and which the three spared into the kitchen. Pat mentioned the changes and repairs he meant shortly to make, which, to the satisfaction of the other men, included restocking the range with cattle. The silent pair were reluctant to disparage Hanlon or his methods to a man whom they scarcely knew, but their attitude was quite plain. As for Nico, he was vastly relieved to see the last of the brutal employer, and was clearly ready to offer Stevens a fanatical alliance, once convinced that his confidence was not misplaced. Pat did not offer to go off the place the following morning, anxious as he was to get organized. Not yet, in the view of the prolonged deed, did he know exactly what move to expect next from Chad Hanlon, and he was taking no chances. Moreover, he was impatient for the return of Ezra and Sam alone. He did not look for their reappearance for another day or two, however, and mid-morning found them occupied with hammer and nails, busily repairing the tumbled-down barn with Nico and Charlie's help, when the echoing crack of a rifle shot rang down the wooded slopes to them from somewhere out on the range. Pat dropped the hammer and stood up. "Now what would that be?" he grunted. "It was a good half-mile down the ridge there," Bain offered, his homely visage expressing relief and apprehension in about equal parts. Pat was measuring the advisability of riding out there to investigate when Nico held up a brown hand. "Cowboys are running, senor," he murmured. A moment later Pat caught it too, a faint thundering rumble of hoofs. He rushed out into the yard, and soon he saw them coming, a wild herd of rushing roans, and he glimpsed a man at their head. "It's Sam and Ezra!" he exclaimed. Sloane was in the lead. He herded the clattering cavalcade into the ranch yard, milling them about the corrals and bringing them to a restless stand. "Help, Ez!" he called to Pat, waving. "He's got Connor over his saddle." Ezra appeared behind the horses, advancing through the billowing dust with a limp form over his saddle bow. Pat saw Chip's tousled, hatless head, his still face smeared with blood. Ezra carefully lifted the puncher down into Pat's arms. "What happened to him?" The latter got out swiftly. "He's knocked out, that's all," the tall redhead grunted briefly. "Some sidewinder blazed away at us with a rifle down the ridge there, and Chip started after him. We found him there laying. Reckon he got knocked against the hull of a tree branch or something." Pat saw the bloody bruise high upon Connor's forehead, and he turned towards the ranch house carrying Chip, and suddenly halted. A girl was riding into the other side of the yard, her head high, and with sharp awareness for all that was going on. It was Marion McLennan. Pat did not recognize the calm-faced man at her side, but both horses bore the sprawling H.M. brand on their hips. The girl took in Pat with cool competentness. She was clad this morning in Levi's and a plaid woolen shirt, and a felt wide brim framed her auburn head. He saw now that her eyes were vivid blue. "Who is that you have there?" she said. "Not Chip." Her breath sucked in. Clearly she was not only knew the puncher, but knew him well, and in an instant she was out of her saddle, running forward. "Lay him here on the porch, gently," she commanded with curt impatience, as Pat banged Connor's head. "Stand aside, please. Nico!" Her words crackled with unconscious authority. "Hot water and rags, Nico. Clean ones, quickly." The man who had come with her exchanged a glance with Pat, smiled faintly. Nico came running a moment later with the things the girl had demanded. No one said anything as Marion took charge, competently caring for Connor's ugly cut. She'd fastened a neat bandage round about his head when he sighed and opened his eyes. "Hiya, Marion," he grinned weakly. "Was that you that hit me that hard?" "Oh, be quiet and lie still and rest. You're too tough to be hurt very badly," she ordered shortly. Without ceremony, then, she whirled on Pat.
I came here expecting to find Mr. Hannon. Who are you? She inquired crisply.
Pat had never been introduced to her, and she did not know he had witnessed her meeting with Hanlon in Alcastre. He chose not to reveal his knowledge of her identity. I don't think Chad'll be back, ma'am, he told her politely.
And why not?
She caught him up sharply.
He belongs here, doesn't he?
Her eyes widened as he shook his head in a decided fashion. I'm afraid he don't anymore.
Well, this is strange.
She was exclaiming him in cold perplexity.
What are you doing here, may I ask?
Just going about my lawful affairs, Pat returned mildly. Marion McLennan's cheeks grew faintly pink, and her chin lifted. Her swift glance lingered on the milling herd of horses, and she noted the repairs on the barn. A crease appeared on her smooth brow.
I'm Marion McLennan from the H.M. to the north of you. You're not...
Her hostile eyes returned to his face with a dawning concern.
You haven't taken over the anvil, surely?
Disbelief was plain in her weighted tone. Yes, ma'am. Glad to know you. The name is Pat Stevens of Colorado. Plainly here was some unwelcome news for the girl.
But this can't be true, she protested strongly. Mr. Hannon said...
Mr. Hannon talks, Pat allowed dryly. But whatever Mr. Hannon says, he sold out day before yesterday. The girl's face suddenly went a bright red and her eyes flashed. She had caught more than an inkling of Pat's reference of what had happened in town. She must have known it was because of her own actions that Chad had decided to sell.
I see,
she said slowly. As she strove to collect her thoughts, her manner grew firm.
Whatever has happened, Mr. Stevens, no doubt you'll consent to sell the anvil in turn to me?
Pat only smiled. Why should I do that? He countered blandly.
But I'm trying to procure it for some time. It's not my fault if Mr. Hannon's perversity was consistently blocking the sale.
She turned to the man who had accompanied her.
Ike Mosher is my foreman. He'll explain to you.
Her cool assurance on her right to purchase whatever she chose only amused Pat. Howdy, Mosher. He nodded cordially. Guess we'll be neighbors, I suppose. Marilyn's color deepened. She looked at him thoughtfully for a space.
This means you refuse?
She demanded swiftly. Sorry, ma'am. Pat's glance was engaging, however unapologetic. I'm afraid it does. She lost her temper then, and it made her magnificent.
I've never heard of a more high-handed affair, she stormed. I want this ranch, and I intend to have it. You'll be glad to sell it to me before you're done, Mr. Stevens.
She turned to her foreman with a dangerous calm.
Come, Ike.
Pat and Connor, the latter sitting on the edge of the porch, a broad grin on his face, watched her leave, her trim back straight as a ramrod. You got yourself in a jackpot now, crossing her, the puncher predicted with a chuckle. Sam Stallone, on the near edge of the horse herd, had been interested here as well. Better watch yourself, he called warningly to Pat when the girl was safely beyond earshot. Reckon she likes your looks. It was a new idea to Pat, as much as he secretly admired Marion McLennan's salty spunk. What makes you think that? He tossed back. No woman ever really gets that mad at a man that she's not downright interested in, Stallone replied shrewdly. Pat laughed. Wait till I saddle up, he said practically. We'll shove your horses into the canyon pasture over yonder, where they can feed up. The herd secured, the men gathered for noon meal. There was a number of things to be talked over now that they were together once more, and Pat told how Ace Cangle had been found murdered, without mentioning his part in the affair, and warned Connor that he would probably be questioned by the sheriff on account of his fight with the straw boss. I ain't got nothing to be scared of, Chip declared quickly. "If somebody knocked Cangle off, they just beat me to it, is all. I'll go down and talk to Hardwick and get it over with right now." "That might be a good idea at that," Pat agreed. "There's something else, too." He told about discharging Epstack. "I'll need hands if I intend to stalk this range. Maybe you know where I could find a couple good men?" "Just leave it to me," Connor told him. "I'll round a couple of boys that you can depend on." He pulled away after dinner, blithe as always. Pat returned to the canyon with Ezra and Sam to look over the horses they had bought. It was agreed upon that they had made quite a bargain, though Salone studiously omitted to explain the circumstances under which it had been found. Pat asked them to remain for a day or two, explaining about the stolen deed and the probable need for a close watch on Chad Hanlon's activities. "Just as I figured," Ezra snorted at the end. "Hanlon's a crook, Pat. Your money made him hungry, but he ain't planning on giving up the ranch after all. He'll be around here making his claim that he never sold out to you. You just mark my words." Pat was afraid he was right, and the conviction was strengthened the following morning when he stepped to the kitchen door to observe two men riding into the yard. One, he saw at once, was Dane Hardwick, the Elcaster sheriff. His concern was not lessened when he noted the second man, whom he didn't know, was wearing a law badge as well. "Morning, Hardwick," he greeted, as Sam and Ezra crowded to the door behind him to peer out. "Didn't expect to see you out here so soon. I trust you got that business of Cangle's killing straightened out finally." "No, I ain't," the lawman grunted. Sitting his saddle, he glanced about, taking in the changes which had already occurred here since Pat had arrived. "See you got a nice bunch of horses out there in the canyon, Stevens. We looked 'em over." Hardwick paused. "Who's in charge of them horses?" Ezra and Sam stepped forward. "Reckon we are, Hardwick," Sam said with a shade of pride. "Why's that?" "You, huh?" The hooded eyes were like blades. "Well, consider yourselves under arrest." Sam's jaw dropped. He was no more surprised than Pat was over the direction things were taken, having both attributed to the sheriff's appearance to be some move of Chad Hanlon's. "What's the charge?" he barked, congested of face. "Possession of stolen stock. Them horses was drifted across the Mexican line 3 nights ago by horse thieves," was the unemotional answer. Pat took in the chagrin expression on the faces of the two partners, and in spite of himself he threw up his head and began to laugh. End of chapter 7.